little by little, welcome everyone and give Deborah the time to let everyone in. We are quite a few tonight, so welcome to this event of the Italian Cultural Institute in Dublin for another meeting with Elena Ferrante through the works and words of people who have studied, translated, and published a book on her. So we are delighted to have Stiliana Milkova, who is a professor at Oberlin College in the USA and she teaches comparative literature, Italian literature and Eastern European literature, and has dedicated much of her effort, many of her efforts to, in fact, also the relationship between visual art and literature. And the book we will be talking about is her latest work, and it is Elena Ferrante's World Literature. To suggest this event was a collaborator, a beloved collaborator of the Italian Cultural Institute, Enrica Maria Ferrara, who teaches Italian at Trinity College Dublin and has already published very much on Italian literature, theater, and cinema. She was with us also to present a book she edited actually very few days ago, and another very successful event. Enrica has a way of encouraging people to read Italian texts, not only from an academic point of view, but also as just a pleasure. And the person who has made Elena Ferrante World Literature is here tonight with us, Ann Goldstein from New York. Both Stiliana and Ann will be more, correctly introduced by Enrica. I can only say that Anne was a copy editor at the New Yorker for many, many years, and she started translating Italian literature quite a long time ago, and has eventually, succeeded in bringing to the American public and to the Anglo-Saxon world a number of Italian writers. Among them, I would like to mention at least Primo Levi and Giacomo Leopardi, and of course, Elena Ferrante, who has become perhaps the way through which Italian literature, contemporary Italian literature, has entered the English-speaking world, but also through the English-speaking world literature. So my name is Renata Sperandio. I'm the director of the Italian Cultural Institute in Dublin, and I'll just give you some housekeeping points. The event will be recorded and will be accessible later on the YouTube channel of the Institute. If you want to ask a question, feel like asking questions, please use the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen, and enjoy the evening, which the event will last around an hour or so, and we'll start with Enrica Ferrara's introduction. So welcome to everyone, and especially to our guests, Stiliana and Enrica.
Thank you, Renata, and it is great to see a big crowd at the Italian Cultural Institute again, and I had no doubt that this event would attract so many people, because Stiliana's work really deserves recognition. And of course, Anne is here, and I'm delighted, I really am honored to present this book. This is the book that we are presenting tonight. It is a timely and timeless piece of research, but it's also a durable object. This is why I'm showing the book. I'm showing the book because I didn't know whether I would receive it, and we have defeated all delays of postal services due to Brexit and COVID-19. So I was delighted to receive the book. It has, you would agree, a stunning cover, marvelous graphic design, spotless editing. It has lovely paper as well. So, I mean, we can't really discard the enormous convenience of ebooks, especially at the present moment. But if, like me, you're still attached to the traditional books, this is certainly a volume that you'll want to have in your library. In my house now, it sits firmly beside all the other books, you know, like, well, the few books of Ferrante criticism that have come out in the last few years. First of all, the foundational study by Tiziana De Rogatis, recently translated into English by Will Schutt. I don't know if Tiziana is here tonight. There are also at least another 2 Italian monographs and some volumes of essays. I would like to mention at least one, that is the collection edited by Stephanie Love and Russo Bullaro in 2016, which is particularly precious to me because it contains an essay by Steliana Milkova on Ferrante's visual poetics, which has been central to my own posthumous reading of Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novels. So the corpus of Ferrante's work is growing exponentially. The famous Ferrante fever has become an academic bug. So it is legitimate to ask the question, what's new in Elena Ferrante as world literature? And this is what I'm going to try and do tonight. So to begin with, it is the first comprehensive scholarly monograph authored in English, so not translated from Italian, and written from the perspective of a comparativist and a translator, which Steliana is. It provides an in-depth analysis of Ferrante's entire fictional and non-fictional corpus, including the less known picture book, The Beach at Night, illustrated by Mara Cerri. And the whole corpus is analyzed through the lens of Freudian psychoanalytical theorists, Greek mythology, feminist philosophy and geography, visual studies, and art history. So this leads me to one of the main features of Milkova's book, which is its interdisciplinary transcultural approach, aiming to show that the reasons for Elena Ferrante's global success are kind of inbuilt within Ferrante's texts that are first and foremost works of world literature. So Steliana Milkova lists some of these aspects in a comprehensive introduction. One is the Ferrante's metaphorics of translation, and I'm not going to talk about this because Anne, I'm sure she will illustrate them for us, and the crucial role of literary translation in its circulation. Ferrante's engagement with the transnational themes that permeate the global novel. The adoption of a peripheral local setting, Naples, for example, and the neighborhood, Rione, from which global matters like gender inequality or violence become amplified. The choice of a standard Italian for her novels with only tiny hues, you know, and echoes of dialect and regional variants, which is also an aspect that makes it into a work of world literature. The classical myths recreated through her plots, that's another important element. And the powerful representation of a female imaginary presented as a valid alternative to a male-dominated epistemic systems and power discourse. So in her introduction, Steliana Milkova also summarizes the main point of contemporary debate around Ferrante's decision to remain anonymous and redefines it through a novel viewpoint, according to which in 2003, Ferrante began, and I quote from her, the long-term project of curating her pseudonymous image. So this is the year when the first edition of La Frantumaglia was published. And in this book, there were some autobiographical texts that readers were struck by their possible inauthenticity. But the point of this non-fictional text is to actively construct what Milkova calls the creation of Elena Ferrante. So essentially an authorial persona. So Steliana Milkova suggested our exegesis should take the biographical details of La Frantumaglia and of incidental inventions at face value and juxtapose them to the fictional elements of Ferrante's stories in order to support and illuminate our interpretation. So Ferrante's self-portrayal as a translator from this point of view acquires unexpected meanings if we interpret the entangled stories of Lina and Elena as a cultural linguistic mediation between Neapolitan and Italian. Similarly, Ferrante's self-construction as a translator of classical text is relevant to us only because, and I have a quote here as well, in co-opting classical text, in classical myth and epic narratives for her plots, Ferrante recuperates women from their liminal position within masculinist text and translations and dramatizes their subjectivity in its complexity and ambiguity, end of quote. So while we cannot be sure 100% that the empirical author Elena Ferrante is a woman, it is crucial that she identifies as female. This is another point Milkova elaborates on and that becomes central to her book, in which she explores Ferrante's concept of a female subject as a porous construct, blurring spatial, geographical, linguistic, and psychosocial boundaries. And this is like very much down my avenue of the posthumanism. A subject shattered by patriarchal violence, which spills out of its margins, as in the famous concept of marginatura, of course, but also capable of achieving a new form and become a site of resistance against that same patriarchal oppression. So women in Ferrante's texts are disfigured, mutilated, they have penetrated bodies, they're living examples of corporeal violence that manifests itself also as a sort of psychological shattering and social liminality. Now, the topic of fragmentation is central to the second chapter of the book, in which Milkova analyzes the two neologisms, frantumaglia and smarginatura, which unarguably encapsulate Ferrante's poetics as they are the fulcrum of her female imaginary. Now, a great achievement of this book is precisely that of examining these contiguous terms as part of a seamless discourse traced all the way back to troubling love, in which, and I quote again, frantumaglia is a woman's internal suffering within the symbolic order, and smarginatura is its symptom, the external manifestation of women's subjugation, end of quote. So prisoners of the male cage, again, this is Milkova's term, a patriarchal order in which instruments of torture and oppression are emblematically phallic shaped. Scissors, paper cutters, safety pins, needles, knives. So the female characters of Ferrante's novels are able to break free from the suffering that phallocentric society place upon them only after experiencing the extreme suffering and the effects of fragmentation. Only then they will be able to gain new agency and appropriate the cutting tools which men had previously used to inscribe their power into their body, into their battered body. So one example of this acquirement of agency is the figure of the seamstress with her needles and scissors that is often found in Ferrante's fictional and non-fictional corpus to signify, in Milkova's persuasive reading, the female creator who repairs and restores the fabric of the world by way of sewing, writing, translating, and reshaping. Beautiful image. Now, a crucial role in the rejection of the archaic patriarchal order and construction of the new female subject in Ferrante's works is played by mothers, who, in Milkova's account, are these figures oscillating between extreme stillness and extreme porosity. In fact, Milkova shows 5 different narrative mechanisms that Ferrante adopts to problematize the mutually exclusive rhetoric of the self-sacrificing mothers and of the selfish mother. These include the poetics of disgust and desires, which as Milkova has demonstrated since 2013, represents one of the main tropes of Ferrante's narrative. I won't list them all, but it is so interesting, you know, how these figures of the mother is problematized in the 5 mechanisms listed by Stiliana Milkova. And when talking about mothers, Milkova also mentions the importance of Ferrante's literary and philosophical mothers. For example, the feminist philosopher Lonzi, Irigaray, Muraro, Cavarero, Braidotti, but also literary mothers like Virginia Woolf, Anna Maria Ortese, Alice Munro, Clarice Lispector, and many others. And she reminds us that Ferrante invokes the creation of a female literary genealogy. So this is particularly relevant when it comes to the trope of female artistic collaboration, which Milkova identifies as instrumental for Ferrante's female subject to acquire agency through the empowerment it produces. Everyone will remember the Neapolitan novels, where the agonistic collaboration between Lina and Elena equals to a subversive feminist act. And Milkova shows us how the protagonists of Ferrante's novels use artistic collaboration to switch from their position of objects to be admired, objectified by the male gaze, and confined in a claustrophobic space such as photograph or paintings, to become subject of artistic creation, collaborating with one another and taking inspiration from one another, and positioning themselves in that liminal space of the frame that connects and separates outside and inside reality and art, subject and object. And in that space, women have the right to actually see their female body mutilated, fragmented and shattered into pieces, like in the collages of Olga and Lila, or in Delia's portrait. And I will soon wrap up, but I want to mention the beautiful chapter 5, in which we follow the steps of Ferrante's characters across 2 main settings, which are Naples and Turin, with their patriarchal topography signifying oppression and confinement, where we have liminal spaces that Milkova describes are courtyards, squares, staircases, cellars, and tunnels, and they form 2 specific chronotypes. So one is the fortress in Turin and the labyrinth in Naples. And the labyrinth is beautifully, outstandingly interpreted by Milkova in connection with the classical myth of Ariadne, Theseus, and the Minotaur. Now, for women to dominate this urban space means to challenge male hegemony and fighting off the trauma relieved in these very small, confined spaces in which they were subjugated and crushed, like, for example, the Don Achilles cellar, if you remember, or Delia's pastry shop. So through artistic creation, women negotiate a way out of the labyrinth and assert the right to create a new feminine city labyrinth of creative power. Now, this discourse is I think, one of Milkova's most original contribution to Ferrante's criticism. Now, the epilogue of the book also retraces all these tropes in The Lying Life of Adults, which had only just been published in English when this book came out, and shows great cohesion in Elena Ferrante's poetics, according to Stiliana Milkova. So in conclusion, it's a book written with remarkable competence and flair, builds on and engages firmly with existing scholarship, and at the same time proposes a profoundly original reading of Ferrante's work. So I hope you all join me to congratulate Stiliana Milkova for her amazing achievement, and most importantly, that you all purchase and read the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrica.
You're very welcome. Thank you for writing the book. Amazing. So I will now would like to, obviously, we'll have time for questions later, but leave the floor to Anne, who is going to comment on the translation aspect of your.
Well, I'm going to comment on quite a different level.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
From you, Enrica. Thank you. That was fascinating. That was great. So I'm just going to give first of all, a little brief history of Ferrante's publication in English and how she became, well, not how, but the trajectory of her popularity, I guess you could say. The first novel by Ferrante to be published in English was The Days of Abandonment in 2005. It was also the first book to be published by Europa Editions, which is an American spin-off of the Italian publisher and the publisher of Ferrante in Italy, Edizioni AO. So it was the book that the publisher had chosen to launch this new venture. So there was a lot of pressure. It did well. The Days of Abandonment was well reviewed, and it was quite successful considering that it was a first book from an unknown author and publisher. Most of its promotion, however, was by word of mouth, and much of that was among writers and, I guess you could say sort of literary circles and women, I guess, especially in the beginning. But it had a following, which was somewhat sustained by Troubling Love, published in English in 2006, and Ferrante's third novel, The Lost Daughter, which was published in 2008 in English. Then in 2012 came My Brilliant Friend, the first of the Neapolitan novels, which was followed in successive years by the three others. It was a really different type of book, much longer, more complex, with a huge cast of characters, whereas the earlier books were shorter, for one thing. You could almost say they were confined, since they were sort of compact, intense explorations of a very limited period in their woman narrator's life. So My Brilliant Friend was announced as the start. I think it was originally announced as the start of a trilogy. I think Ferrante didn't even know how many books it was going to be. And she originally wanted to publish it as one book, but she was dissuaded by the publisher. Being quite a book. So anyway, but in January of 2013, right after My Brilliant Friend was published, James Wood in the New Yorker wrote a basically rave review of Ferrante's work up until then. And that was really sort of the beginning of her becoming known. Because by a year later, when the second of the Neapolitan novels was published, The Story of a New Name, she was beginning to be popular. And Michael Reynolds, who was the editor-in-chief of Europa Editions, said there was kind of a strong, steady build that eventually became Ferrante fever. So a year after that was really, or 2 years after that was really the height of Ferrante fever. And of course, how to explain it? No one has ever really successfully explained it. Maybe Stiliana does kind of explain it, but I mean, just on a sort of superficial level. I mean, these books touched something both universal and specific in the readers. So certainly I would say nobody had any idea, contrary to what Renata says, nobody really had any idea that they were going to be so popular, I don't think. But they were. And then for me, of course, the second surprise was that the translator became important, which is extremely unusual. So mainly, of course, because of the author's absence and the need or desire of readers to have a face, a person to attach to the book. Of course, I'm not the author and I can't speak about the book the way the author might. But I agreed to take on this role as, I don't know, sort of representative. First of all, because I love the books and naturally I wanted to promote them. And secondly, because I thought it was a way of drawing attention to the translator, to the role of the translator, that it was good for all translators for a translator to be, kind of public almost. You could say it's strange that it's taken the absence of the author for this to become, for the translator to appear. Or as Stiliana, she talks about this in great detail in her introduction. And as she says, Ferrante's invisibility has enabled the translator's visibility, which I thought was it's a great way of putting it. It's been suggested that, as Enrica sort of touched on this, that Ferrante herself is a translator. The case has been made that she is, in fact, the German to Italian translator Anita Raya, but no one has ever said that whether that's true or not. I mean, it's not, I don't think it is true. Anyway, whatever. But Stiliana points out that Ferrante speaks about translating from Greek and Latin. And it seems obvious that she studied classics. I think that's something we can assume that it's not part of her false creation or her created character. It seems like she must have studied classics in some way. But she talks about it really as a way of learning to write, that she translated from Greek and Latin as an exercise in a way. But then every writer is in some sense a translator of the world in her head to the world on the page. In Ferrante, I'm just going to talk about one way in which this is made explicit, which is the relationship between Italian and dialect, or the tension between Italian and dialect. Both Ferrante as the author and in the Neapolitan novels, Lanoux as the narrator are negotiating between the two. Ferrante doesn't write in dialect, as Enrica said. The dialect comes to us already translated, so to speak. It's translated by Elena or by Lanoux or by Elena Ferrante or by Elena Greco, depending on how you're reading it. So dialect is, of course, the language of the neighborhood, the language of the home and family, the language of parents and children. It's also the language of violence and brutality and of intense, strong emotion. It has to be translated into Italian through Lanoux's experience. Italian is also, it's a language that's learned in school. And there are various levels of it, of course. There's elementary school Italian, there's high school Italian, there's university Italian, and it's constantly changing. But one of the first places where this Italian dialect division comes up, and where we see, in a sense, the process of translation, is when Elena and Lila climb the stairs to Don Achile's apartment to get their dolls back. Eventually, he gives them some money and says, go buy some new dolls. This conversation takes place mainly in dialect, and it's specified that it takes place mainly in dialect. But as the girls turn to leave, Lanoux, who's standing on the stairs, utters a sentence, and she specifies that this sentence she's speaking in Italian. Quote, I said in Italian, buonasera e buon appetito, good evening and enjoy your meal. It's as if she were now separating herself from her surroundings, both physically and linguistically. And she is in some sense sealing this division with a formal statement. She has taken, you could say, the literal meaning of translated, translatus, of carried across, and translated herself into a different place. So I think you could say this is just an example of something that does go on in the book. The fact that Ferrante doesn't actually write in dialect, of course, as Stiliana points out, makes life a lot easier for the translator. And yet, even without dialect, no translation is easy. My introduction, my first encounter with Ferrante was in The Days of Abandonment, which is a book that's so gripping, so intense, that it's kind of claustrophobic. You just want to get out of there. But of course, if you're the translator, you have to stay there because you got to keep going. And so the way I escaped, in a way, was by focusing on the words, by focusing on the sentences, on the building blocks, the individual pieces of the sentences, and also the meaning. And I'm tempted to say, of course, that any translation is a relentless search for words, for looking up, is a search for words, looking up words, thinking about words. For example, in the scene where Olga thinks she's locked in her apartment, I became totally preoccupied with the parts of a lock. Like, how are they going to, I mean, Italian locks are different from English locks. So it was like a little bit of a nightmare figuring this all out. I did eventually, I guess. And I guess, can I just say one more thing about frantumalia, which is, of course, crucial to Ferrante and crucial to Stiliana's book. Which is that, first of all, by the time I came to translate the book, La Frantumalia, which is the collection of pieces, of various pieces, I had totally forgotten that the word appears in The Lost Daughter. So I was reminded of that by you, Stiliana. And then, but of course, when I was working on The Lost Daughter, I didn't know that some years later, I would read a much more complex version of the word frantumalia. So I had only, when I translated the word in The Lost Daughter, I had only my own, like sort of working backwards, thinking about frantumare, the verb shatter. I translated it as shattering. I mean, I don't know, I didn't know it would be so important to Ferrante. I didn't know that there would be the whole essay about it, a whole book named after it. So, you just have what you have at at the moment. And I translated it as shattering. And, you know, I don't know, if I'd known what I knew later, I might have done something different. Then again, it's also, it's in a dialogue where she's talking to the younger woman. She says, she says, my mother used another word. Well, it's almost exactly what she says in La Frantumalia. My mother had a word for this. She called it Frantumalia, which in The Lost Daughter is just called a shattering. I mean, in English. Anyway, it's just one example of how you don't know really what you may not know what you're doing, and you may find out later. but also just the importance of every single word. And you only can do what you can do with the knowledge that you have at that moment. Anyway, that's just one example of course, every word doesn't have all that behind it, but many words do. So Stiliana and Enrica, back to you.
Right.
Great, so good to hear you speaking about this. I'm sure Stiliana would like to comment that. I love that. I love that passage and that explanation from Stiliana that the term Frantumalia occurred first in The Lost Daughter.
I know.
You know, because like I read The Lost Daughter in Italian first, and I realized, yes, well, that is the same words. But I read it later, you know, later on after Frantumalia had been published. I read it myself as well. But I think Stiliana, you know, puts it so well in perspective, you know, like how also the change of translation is very relevant, I think. You know, I don't know if Diana wants to comment on this aspect.
Sure. But before I address or comment on Ann's remarks, I wanted to thank you, Enrica, for your beautiful and illuminating overview of the book. It really captured so many of the key ideas. I also want to thank Renata Sperandio for inviting me to do this book presentation and for organizing it. And of course, many thanks to Ann for her interesting and insightful remarks. Thank you for your time, Ann. It's wonderful to have you here, but also you are the reason why Elena Ferrante is world literature. So it's your fault if you're all here. And finally, my gratitude to everyone who is here. I realized that I think there are more than 100 people here, but it looks like only 100 can go in. So I'm glad that everyone who came early was able to enter and be with us. So back to Ann's remarks. Ann, thank you for taking us through the history of Elena Ferrante's success and the ways in which you grappled with translating her language. This idea of frantumalia, and frantumalia is a key concept in Elena Ferrante's work. So just a very brief comment, and then I think I need to go back to Enrica. But frantumalia is a very interesting word because it's unusual in Italian too. It's a kind of neologism, or at least a word that Ferrante attributes to her own mother. So it's a lexical neologism. It's a lexical bond to the mother's body, to the mother's language. And so translating it poses a huge challenge for the translator, and this is one of the signs which tells us that Ferrante is not writing for translation. She's not writing to be read in English. She's not writing to be popular or to become a best-selling author. She is writing what she thinks she should be writing. And so translating Frantumalia in 2007 or 2000, whenever The Lost Daughter came out, I think is a problem. It's a challenge. You cannot translate Frantumalia because it's a word that doesn't exist in Italian, doesn't exist in English. And so Anne renders it as shattering, which is as closely as possible. It's a gloss, or it's an interpretation. It's a translation of what Ferrante intends, of this concept. But then almost 10 years later, when Ferrante is a huge success, when she has become a global phenomenon, then Anne has the license to translate Frantumalia as Frantumalia, to preserve the original word. So we have an entire volume called Frantumalia. And so I think this is a sign of the cultural capital that Ferrante has accrued. It's a sign of her success. It's a sign of the kind of wide circulation that her novels have achieved. So in all of this is just in this movement, or this development of translation from shattering, Frantumalia as shattering, to Frantumalia as Frantumalia. So this is all I want to say in terms of Ann's comments. And Enrica, back to you.
Yes, yes, I think we can properly start the interrogation here. We can ask a few questions to you if you don't mind, as the author of the book. Yes, I thank you. You know, I'm delighted that you like my introduction, but at the same time, I do realize that with a book so rich and so original like yours, I think, you know, I might have left something out, or there might be other aspects that you would like to expand on. And for example, I'll be also curious at how do you engage with Ferrante scholarship in the book, and you know, like if there is any, you can comment on this aspect maybe, and if there is any other aspect that you would like to expand on.
Thank you. That's a great question. So I think what's worth noting is that this book actively engages and acknowledges Ferrante scholarship. And I mean Ferrante scholarship written both in Italian and in English. It builds on previous research. It engages in a dialogue with scholars, with publications, and at the same time, it proposes new approaches to reading Ferrante's works. So the way I intended it, and what I was hoping I would accomplish, is to create a kind of reference tool or an overview of Ferrante studies to date. Of course, more articles and more scholarship is being published as we speak, but historically, or in terms of a moment, I was hoping that I could capture the landscape or the panorama of Ferrante studies circa 2020. And so this is one of the goals of the book. And the second goal of the book was really to kind of begin to build and participate in a female genealogy of Ferrante scholars. And what I mean is the ways in which this book was born out of so many conversations and so many collaborations and productive exchanges with Ferrante scholars, and many of them are here tonight. So I'm grateful to them, and I want to mention that their work is acknowledged, cited, and recognized, and greatly appreciated. So it's a book that enters in a dialogue with other scholars. It cites and acknowledges their work, and then it builds on it. So in a way, it's an acknowledgement of all the hard work that has gone into establishing a field of Ferrante studies.
And I agree with you, and I have to say that it is incredible how many references, you know, like even though like the book is so enjoyable to read, you know, like you don't feel that there is a pause or anything, but so many, so much work on Elena Ferrante has been referenced in the book. So I definitely, I endorse that definitely. And so yes, and I love that idea of the female genealogy. I think it's very true, you know, and especially if you think about that conference in which we met in Durham. That was the first conference on Elena Ferrante, wasn't it? So many beautiful papers and female scholars in particular that were talking about Ferrante. And yes, and do you think, is there any part of the book that you would like to expand on, or you're happy?
Yes, thank you for giving me the opportunity to just say only a couple of things. So I think you mentioned already, and Anne walked us through the timeline of Ferrante's works, but my goal was to recuperate for scholarly analysis and to really expand on Ferrante's first 3 novels. So she wrote 3 very short, concise, experimental novels, and defined The Days of Abandonment, her second novel, as claustrophobic. And they very much are claustrophobic novels, but they're there, they're part of her poetics. So my book tries to trace a typology and a genealogy of Ferrante's poetics, beginning with her very first novels, the 3 short texts that Anne mentioned, and then moving on to her children's book, The Beach at Night, and then following with the Neapolitan novels, the 4 volumes, and of course with her latest novel, The Lying Life of Adults, while all the time keeping an eye on her non-fictional writing, the voluminous book, or it's rather hefty, the Frantumalia, 400 plus pages, then her collected essays for The Guardian in Incidental Inventions. And I should mention that Frantumalia went through 3 different editions. The first one, the expanded, and then the really large and expanded one, which followed her success, international success. So the book traces a typology and genealogy of Ferrante's poetics, and in particular, it argues for Ferrante's articulation of a theory. And then I think I want to stress this, that Ferrante articulates a theory of female experience, and particularly of maternal experience. of maternal experience, subjectivity, and identity. And then she not only articulates it and builds it, but she also enacts it. She applies it and tests it on the pages of her novels, so that she's elaborating a theory and a practice simultaneously. And it is, I think, this theory and practice revolves around the two concepts that both Enrica and Anne already touched on, frantumalia and smarginatura. So these are the concepts that I see as linguistic, psychical, corporeal, and spatial coordinates of the female subjects that Ferrante at once theorizes and narrates. So I'm looking at these again, and I repeat because this is, I think, some of the key expression in the book, the psychical, linguistic, corporeal, and spatial coordinates of her maternal discourse and the theory of maternal subjectivity and identity.
Yes, and I think you're very persuasive in arguing that. I really do, and I think the whole chapter about the mother and daughter bond is fascinating. And there is a specific and a special story about. I know that you talk about it in your introduction about how your personal bond with your mother helped you through the interpretation of this mother-daughter bond. And I wanted to ask you about that, if you could tell us that story. And I also would like to ask you, what is specifically, what specific point or what aspect in this mother-daughter bond that other scholars have also studied are original and are particular, are specific of Milkova's interpretation?
Great, thank you. So yes, I do have a personal anecdote about the writing of this book. So when I was actively drafting and researching the book, I was talking to my mother, and my mother, who is Bulgarian like me and lives in Bulgaria, and I am in Bulgaria at the moment. So my mother was really interested in Ferrante, and so she asked me to look at the book. She asked for the books, and she started reading them. She first read them in English, so she devoured everything Ferrante had written up to this point in English. So that means the 3 short novels, the Neapolitan novels, and Frantumalia. And so she not only read them in English, but she annotated the books. She underlined and put little notes, and she began interrogating me, and she handed the books back to me, and we started talking about them. And so this productive exchange, this dialogue ensued, and it was not always pleasant, I must admit, because she often challenged my ideas or debated and interrogated my interpretation. So we had lengthy discussions. So in a way, this book is born out of the discussions with my mother. So she offering her own interpretations, me arguing back, glossing with the Italian, and then she read them in Bulgarian. And so, there's my mother who reads in English and then reads in Bulgarian all of Ferrante's works. And I see this as an example of how Ferrante's works have circulated around the world. I mean, what other example do you need of them reaching an English-speaking reader and a Bulgarian-speaking reader at the same time? So it just shows how Ferrante circulates far outside its culture of origins.
Yes, absolutely. And I love the idea that your mother was challenging your interpretation. I mean, you're a Ferrante scholar, but I'm sure, like that, she was giving you a lot of food for thought.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, very much so. And of course, food for thought based on her own experience, which is valuable. So in a way, it is my relating to my own mother by way of this book as well.
Yes, and the fact that the experience of mother and daughter and the mother-daughter bond is so relevant in Ferrante's work, and I think one of the reasons why he makes us so passionate in discussing it with our own mothers is also because we can see the elements of this bond, very, very strong in the novel. So what is your specific interpretation, or what is new in your interpretation, you think, in your opinion?
Yes, very briefly. So very briefly, what I'm arguing in the book is that Ferrante's theory practice that I described earlier articulates a maternal discourse, but it's a discourse that's embodied and spatialized. That is, it is really grounded in the maternal body, in the physicality and materiality and bodily processes of the mother. And Ferrante conceives of and describes the mother's body as bleeding, leaking, disfigured, ontologically unstable, and threatening. And in this way, she is at once representing a dominant idea in Western cultural traditions. The mother's body is ontologically unstable and frightening, but then reappropriating it and reconfiguring it. And she's showing how mothers can relate to their daughters and to their own mothers in different ways, not necessarily through the mechanisms of disgust, instability, and so disgust, instability, and other dominant ideas of femininity and motherhood, but rather by inventing words, the word frontomalia, so lexical bonds, or through objects such as dolls or pictures, or through laughter, for example, or obscene gestures, through creative practices such as drawing or sewing or painting, or even through the cities that they inhabit and traverse. So the maternal discourse and the bond, the mother-daughter bond, is expressed in different ways, not through the dominant discourses of femininity and motherhood, but rather by finding other ways of realizing that connection between mothers and daughters.
Yeah, and that there is, what is fascinating is also like this antagonism, you know, there is a big antagonism, you know, between the daughter and mother and daughter, and the daughters, as you described, the daughters essentially have to antagonize the mothers, and at the same time they internalize their power to unleash their creative power and become
absolutely.
Yeah, I found that's very enlightening, I have to say, very enlightening. I think, you know, we are really, I'm conscious of time, but I would like to ask you the question, a question about the cities. You know, like the cities are very, very important. And I had some notes here. Yes, when I was reading your book, I had a feeling that you actually knew, and you had been in the cities of Napoli and Turin, and that you actually had, in fact, compared the places described by Elena Ferrante with the real topographies. And I wanted to ask you how differently she described, you know, does she have a different way of describing Turin or describing Naples, you know, like in terms of narrative mechanism, in terms of the realism and the way she describes the two cities?
Great question. So I think I argue for Ferrante's topographic realism, that her settings are actual, real, identifiable, traceable, locatable settings that you can actually use Google Maps to find. And so on the one hand, we have Naples. And Naples is recognizable and relatable because it's at the same time a local specific city and a global metropolis. It is plagued by all the problems characteristic of a modern urban metropolis. So you have everything: poverty, crime, corruption, lack of access to education, underrepresented and marginalized communities. You have sharp divisions in terms of class, income, education, even ways of speaking. So Naples is recognizable and relatable in that way. You also have urban structures such as the train tracks, the tunnel, the underpass, the projects, the street culture, the graffiti, public monuments, gardens, other urban sites that are familiar and recognizable. They don't have to be Neapolitan for us to relate to them. So in that way, Naples is at the same time a local specific place, but also a global universal metropolis. And this is, I think, this explains why so many readers can relate easily and inhabit the Neapolitan setting of her novel. On the other hand, she gives us metaphorical building blocks or frames for representing cities. And Naples, as you said, is a kind of labyrinth. But this is also, any city could be a labyrinth. I can think of a number of cities that are labyrinths. So even Benjamin in his childhood talks about Berlin and the city as a labyrinth. So then there are these metaphorical structures of frames that she gives us to think about cities. And then finally, she gives us very specific mappable locations. And I think Turin is, in a way, more modern and more mappable than Naples. If Naples is the archaic and modern, and this is Tiziana de Rogatis talks about this, the conflation of archaic and modern and ultra-modern in Naples, then Turin is a kind of modern, ultra-modern, industrial, cultural hub that Ferrante presents to us and this is to me the really interesting part, as the place from where Elena Greco is writing the Neapolitan novels. And I want to remind everyone that the Neapolitan novels are framed by a prologue and epilogue set in Torino. Elena Greco is writing from Torino. This is the place from where the narrative is emerging. This is where she's writing the Neapolitan novels. And what's even more interesting is that Ferrante gives us the almost exact location from where Elena Greco is writing. She tells us several times, and unless the reader miss the reference, Elena Greco is writing from an apartment overlooking the Princess Isabella Bridge and the Valentino Park. So we can, I've walked those itineraries. I've been there. I found the building where I think Elena Greco is writing from. And this is the exact same location in the Days of Abandonment. This is the setting of the Days of Abandonment. Olga, the narrator, is writing from that same apartment. We even have the 5th floor apartment there. And so Torino is mappable. Torino is a kind of real world geography that Ferrante is giving us. And I think there are ways in which, by mapping the itineraries represented in Ferrante's novels, we're actually walking in her character's shoes, and we can experience urban topography and the way that urban topography shapes the body and shapes the mind as well. So this is what Ferrante is doing. She's articulating, she is engendering a female way of walking in the city.
That's brilliant. And I find brilliant also the fact that you demonstrate how women have to, in a sense, they have to dominate those topographies, like that they have to, because like those topographies are nearly an expression of a male-dominated society. You describe the monuments, like the male monuments, like they're symbols of patriarchal power. I don't want to spoil the little reading that we're going to do, but I wanted to know, maybe you could introduce it a little bit, because I think it's about time for that scene or that passage of the Days of Abandonment that Anne is going to read for us.
Right, thank you. And yes, and this is exactly, it's the perfect segue for the passage that Anne will read. It's from the Days of Abandonment. And I will just frame the reading. It's August, and Olga, the narrator, is at her wit's end how to keep her children entertained during the summer. It is hot, and usually they'd be on vacation at that time, but Olga has been left by her husband, and she's on her own, and instead they're stuck in a hot and unwelcoming city. And she's from Naples, not from Turin, so she feels foreign and uncomfortable in this setting. So Anne, if we may turn to you.
Sure. So they is the children. They wouldn't calm down. Ilaria wanted to taste all 110 flavors promised by a gelato maker under the portico of Via Cernaia. I tugged at her and she dug in her heels, pulling me toward the entrance of the shop. Suddenly, Gianni left me and ran across the street by himself amid honking horns, followed by my cries of apprehension. He wanted to see yet again the monument to Pietro Mica, whose story Mario had told him in every detail. I couldn't contain them in the city that was emptying and raising hot, foggy breezes or oppressive humidity from the hills, the river, the pavement. Once we quarreled right there in the gardens in front of the Artillery Museum, under the dirty green statue of Pietro Mica, with the big sword and the fuse. I knew almost nothing about those murdered heroes, fire and blood. You don't know how to tell a story, the child said to me. You don't remember anything. I retorted, then ask your father. And I began to shout that if in their opinion I was no good, they should go to him. There was a new mother, beautiful and smart, certainly from Turin. I would bet she knew everything about Pietro Mica and that city of kings and princesses, of haughty people, cold people, metal automatons. I screamed and screamed, out of control. Gianni and Ilaria loved the city. The boy knew its streets and its legends. His father often let him play near the monument at the end of Via Mucci. There was a statue they both liked. What nonsense, memorials of kings and generals on the streets. Gianni dreamed of being like Ferdinand of Savoy at the Battle of Novara, when he jumps down from his dying horse, saber in hand, ready to fight. Ah yes, I wished to wound them, my children. I wished to wound above all the boy, who already had a Piedmontese accent. Mario too spoke like a Turinese now. He had eliminated the Neapolitan cadences utterly. Gianni acted like an impudent young bull. I detested it. He was growing up foolish and presumptuous and aggressive, eager to shed his own blood or that of others in some uncivilized conflict. I couldn't bear it anymore. I left them in the gardens beside the fountain and set out quickly along Via Galileo Ferraris toward the suspended figure of Victor Emmanuel II, a shadow at the end of parallel lines of buildings, high up against a slice of warm, cloudy sky. Maybe I really wanted to abandon them forever, forget about them, so that when Mario finally showed up again, I could strike my forehead and exclaim, "Your children? I don't know, I seem to have lost them." The last time I saw them was a month ago in the gardens of the Cittadella. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. So this is a perfect passage that illustrates the way that cities and identities are intertwined in Ferrante's novels. The city is the main protagonist in this passage. Olga has clearly lost her patience. She's angry. She's upset with both her children and with her husband, who has left her. And then she projects her anger onto the city's monuments, onto the urban fabric. And these monuments, this urban fabric, become emblems of her husband's mastery of the city. He is a Torinese now. He's mastery of its language. He's lost his Neapolitan accent. And then also of the city's history. He tells the story much better than Olga. Olga doesn't even know the story. So even storytelling, narratives are male-dominated as well. And so Olga is also frustrated with her own exclusion from the city. She's excluded not only from her own husband's life, but also from the city. The city is hostile and aggressive to her. So she is both trapped in the city and excluded from it at the same time. And so it's not just the city, but also the motherhood is projected, or problematic motherhood is projected onto the urban fabric. She is fantasizing about being a bad mother. She is refusing to idealize motherhood and to endorse it as a stable or gratifying identity. So we see all of this in this passage. And on top of that, we see how Turin meets Naples through language, through cadence, through accent, through inflection of speech. Olga's inner turmoil, which is the trauma that she's going through, and the novel's drama, the plot, what happened, who is Mario's lover, why was she abandoned, are being played out onto the city streets. And then some of the resolutions of the drama are played out in the city streets too. So this is what I mean by the topographic narrative or topographic realism of Ferrante's novels. It's very much there. I've mapped these itineraries, and I have to tell you that this intersection and the artillery gardens, I've seen many parents walk through it, and I was terrified every time because it's a big intersection. So Olga is definitely performing a problematic motherhood there as well. Okay, so
fascination, and now it's your turn.
Yes, but I think maybe we should skip. Should we skip?
Okay. No, I don't know. Like we maybe take question. We have another passage to read, but we don't know whether we have enough time now with the question and answers. Maybe Renata can illuminate.
Sure, you can. I mean, if you wanted to take the questions after the reading, that would be fine. Or
yeah, I think it'd be nice, Tiliana, to hear you reading that passage.
Okay, I'm ready. Okay, so I'm going to frame it. I like framing things.
Yeah.
So this passage is Lila's research on Naples in The Story of the Lost Child. This is the 4th volume of the tetralogy, and it's a passage which showcases the layered history of Naples. The history of its streets, its squares, its contemporary topography. And Lila is telling Elena about what lies underneath their feet, about their walking itineraries, and how the walking itineraries, in fact, unfold and reveal a layered history, a stratigraphy of their quotidian experiences. So, and then on top of that, Elena suspects that Lila is writing a history of Naples. That is, she's putting together her wanderings through the city into a narrative. And Elena feels competitive, of course. But in that way, streets, narrative, and topography are connected. So here it is. Elena is reporting Lila's words, inserting Lila's stories. Once she talked to me about violence. We believed, she said, that it was a feature of the neighborhood. We had it around us from birth. It brushed up against us, touched us all our lives. We thought we were unlucky. You remember how we used words to cause suffering and how many we invented to humiliate? You remember the beatings that Antonio, Enzo, Pasquale, my brother, the Solaris, and even I, and even you, gave and took? You remember when my father threw me out the window? Now I'm reading an old article on San Giovanni a Carbonara where it explains what the Carbonara or Carbonetto was. I thought that there was coal there once, and coal miners, but no, it was the place for the garbage. All cities have them. It was called Fosso Carbonario. Dirty water ran in it. Animal carcasses were tossed into it. And I'm skipping a little bit. Ah, the violence, tearing, killing, ripping. Lila, between fascination and horror, spoke to me in a mixture of dialect, Italian, and very educated quotations that she had taken from who knows where and remembered by heart. The entire planet, she said, is a big fosso carbonario. And at times I thought that she could have held crowded rooms fascinated, but then I brought her down to size. She's a barely educated woman of 50. She doesn't know how to do research. She doesn't know what the documentary truth is. She reads, she's excited, she mixes truth and falsehood, she imagines no more. What seemed to interest and absorb her most was that all that filth, all that chaos of broken limbs and dug-out eyes and split heads was then covered, literally covered, by a church dedicated to San Giovanni Battista and by a monastery of Augustinian hermits who had a valuable library. Ha ha, she laughed. Underneath there's blood, and above, God, peace, prayer, and books. Thus the coupling of San Giovanni and the Fosso Carbonario, that is to say, the place name of San Giovanni a Carbonara, a street we've walked on thousands of times, Leno. It's near the station, near Forcella and the Tribunali. I knew where the street of San Giovanni a Carbonara was. I knew it very well, but I didn't know those stories. She talked about it at length. She talked so as to let me know, I suspected, that the things she was telling me orally she had in substance already written, and they belonged to a vast text whose structure, however, escaped me. I wondered, what does she have in mind? What are her intentions? Is she organizing her wandering and readings, or is she planning a book of Neapolitan curiosities, a book that, naturally, she'll never finish? And I'll stop here. Okay, so this was the passage about Naples.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And I have to say, being Neapolitan, I can actually see precisely what Elena Ferrante and Ann Goldstein are doing in this passage, and how, all the layers.
And the voices, the intertwining of voices too.
Yes, it's actually an intertwining of voices, and at the same time, and the history of places, and at the same time, all the layers, because like it is true that, underneath Naples is empty, there are all these ruins, and churches are built over other strata. There was like this famous digging of the underground in Naples where they had to stop many times because like they were finding ruins and temples, and and it was like this is what Naples is like. So it is beautiful how Ferrante's managed to put it all together, in the intertwining of voices, as you say, as well, the dialect, the language, etc. Beautiful. Now, we have a few questions from the audience. I'm sure the audience is dying to ask questions. So and now there is one, the first one. Now, I don't know if it is for you or for Anne, possibly. Taking a look at all the body from Francesca, taking a look at all the body of work of Ferrante, have you noticed a sort of emancipation in the language used by the women characters with the evolving of the female role? Now, I'm not sure if it is just in one or I suppose in the whole body of work. Yes.
I don't really know how to answer that. I mean, in a funny way, I'm like the least qualified person because I've never looked at the body of Ferrante's work. I mean, I only look at it.
So has your approach also evolved? I think that's a question. Has your approach to translating Ferrante, has your vocabulary changed, or?
I don't think so. I mean, of course, with individual words like frantumaglia, it might obviously changed. But I think that basically I'm still looking at it sentence by sentence. I mean, it's really a detailed view of things, and I don't think that changes. In a funny way. It's like I've actually never read the Neapolitan novels all the way through because they weren't ever all published. I mean, when I was working on each one, on the earlier ones, the later ones weren't written yet. So it's funny, I sometimes think about having, like, what would I have done different? I mean, I might have done things differently, but I think that the way I work has been the same. And I can't say that I've seen I mean, yes, the sentences are different in the Neapolitan novels from the way they are in Troubling Love and The Days of Abandonment. The style is has changed. I mean, the sentences are more elaborate, longer, I think. But I don't notice something as detailed as that.
I think, if you think about The Days of Abandonment and the scene of you know, the lovemaking with Carrano, between Olga and Carrano, for example, you know, like there are some like quite graphic scenes and you know, like vocabulary that is used as emancipated from that point of view, if we want to, and you know, like similarly to possibly The Line Life of Adults.
Right. I mean, that's the scene of Giovanna losing her virginity there. I mean, there's definitely a connection.
Yes. Yeah. True. I think
the emancipation perhaps is also in terms of characterizations. In the Neapolitan novels, we have a professional writer who is creating these 4 volumes. And so of course, her language is more complex. All the plots that she is keeping together, the kinds of negotiations and juggling that she's doing in terms of time, she's shifting back and forth. She is trying to keep hold of multiple characters in multiple language at the same time, dialect, standard Italian. So I think the emancipation is in terms of the kind of character who is narrating. In this case, Elena Greco is a professional writer.
Yeah.
True. Yes. So we're happy with that. We answered this question. Now, there's another question here. Is it that dialect is the language of violence, or that Italian imposes violence on those who speak it, in particular the women of the world of dialect? I don't know if I am, can you read that question, maybe Anne and Stiliana as well?
Yeah. I think dialect is not just the language of violence in the novels. It's also the language of the heart, the mother's language. Right. It's the mother's tongue. And scholars Catherine Welling-Georgi has talked about it's the mother tongue. It's intimate. And Elena Greco says it's our language of candor between Lila and her. It's where they're honest, they speak the truth. So dialect is actually a very ample and rich register in Ferrante's novels. And I believe that the Neapolitan dialect too is a very rich language with its own tradition. So it's not just violence. I think it's a very, very layered and expansive language.
But it is true though that when characters get really emotional, when they're angry, for example, yeah, that would be in that case. But like, yes, I don't think I would agree with you, and I'm sure Anne might want to say something about this. But I've been in Neapolitan. I know that it's as a social act, like that it is obviously spoken in different circumstances, and also depending on behavior, and depending on the social occasion, and different things, and that transpires, and this is realistic in the Neapolitan novels. And what do you think, Anne?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think it's, but I don't think it's imposed. I mean, I don't think Italian imposes violence, I guess. I mean, I think it's what comes out in violence when something is violent. I mean, it's what.
Well, maybe I was just wondering if it is like the Italian is imposed with violence, as in like, I don't know, like people are forced to speak Italian, but I don't think this is the case.
No, yeah. I don't think so. I don't know.
Okay, so so Francesco Chianese comments, I lived in Naples and I lived in Turin, and I can see the how she perfectly pictures both cities. Okay, Serena says, I believe this book opens a huge and wonderful opportunity for Italian literary criticism as a whole. If there is time, I would like Stiliana to comment on that, considering how well she knows how creative and productive mostly female scholarship has become since Ferrante has received proper recognition. So
I'm still reading the questions. Okay.
Well, we do.
Yes. Well, opening. Yes, absolutely. I think Serena has put it very nicely. It does open many opportunities for Italian literary criticism, and especially for the work of female scholars. And I found this, and this is a personal anecdote too, but studying Elena Ferrante's works, I have come across and befriended so many brilliant scholars, female scholars, and we have established a kind of alliance of friendship where we not only engage with each other's work, we cite each other, we acknowledge each other's work, but we are mutually enriched through our friendship, through our scholarship. And so I think it is this kind of productive collaboration, this kind of really generative exchange that Ferrante generates in those who study her. And so I think this is the kind of opportunity that I see Serena referencing and that I see at work in the field of Ferrante studies.
And I would agree 100%. And this is, I can endorse this. I would like to also remind everyone that Stiliana is a fantastic editor. She is an amazing mentor for, like I can see postgraduates and people and collaborators, like who are working with Reading and Translation, which is the journal that she edits and she's founded as well. And yesterday there was a special issue on Natalia Ginzburg that came out. I'm sure it's going to be a roaring success with first translation, essays, interviews on Natalia Ginzburg. And I think it is beautiful how, in a sense, you are making this Ferrante effect happen. As in, like, I wanted to ask you about this, if I can, like I have this privilege here. What do you think about the Ferrante effect? Is it true? What is it? You mentioned it to Momigliano. I mentioned it in 2019. Something is happening in women writing that Ferrante is making happen with
yes,
and Ann Goldstein, of course.
Yeah. Yes, I think thanks to Ann Goldstein and thanks to Ferrante's success, we have this Ferrante effect where more women are being translated. And I think this is very important because generally fewer women are translated in English. So more women are being translated in English, but also in Italy, more women are being published and reviewed and awarded prizes. So there's this positive effect of Ferrante's success. Although I have to qualify that, and I'm drawing on Cecilia Schwartz's research, which says that although Ferrante has been very successful, she is still not included in anthologies of contemporary Italian literature. Scholars, and primarily male scholars, ignore her works and leave her out, exclude her from dominant narratives, from the master narrative of contemporary Italian literature. So we need to keep that in mind, that there is that phenomenon at work as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I want to see if there is anyone else that want to ask a question here. I don't think I've seen any other question in the chat. So I suppose, like in the old days, we would go to the library and toast with a glass of wine. And we can do it now, the beautiful library of the Institute. What do you think, Renata?
This time we just delayed that to a later date, but it will happen because I'm sure there will be a chance for you to be in Dublin to talk about Ferrante and other writers. I totally agree with the idea that it's a circle that has started to get in motion. And in fact, an interest in Italian literature and of course also in Italian women writers has started thanks to Ferrante. So it is something that seems to have gone outside of Italy, has moved in the world and is coming back. So it is something that will probably continue. And I see in the public also scholars that have dedicated a lot of their efforts to Elena Ferrante, Tiziana De Rogatis, with whom we were supposed to have an event, and then it COVID-19 prevented us from doing it. But so there are many future events to organize. So I thank you very much for being part of this, and hope to see you back here at the Institute soon. Next Thursday, there will be an event about a certain kind of smarginatura. It is on borders, maps, and territories in a philosophical sense. It is at 5 o'clock on Zoom, and it's with Achille Vazzi and Andrea Borghini. Thank you all. And for the glass of wine in the library, let's get organized and let's keep in touch. Thank you very much.
That would be fantastic.